Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Dr. William Dahut, who is the Chief Scientific Officer of the American Cancer Society. Dr. Dahut, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today.
So, we're talking about the state of cancer drugs and the shortages. First of all, where are we, and is this anything new?
Well, it's not actually new. Right now, it's a little bit more dire. Out of, I think, 130 drugs currently on the FDA's list of shortages, 15 are cancer drugs. And what's a little bit more concerning is that a lot of these drugs are actually drugs that are used in upfront therapies.
Mm-hmm.
So therapies that are part of regimens which we think could potentially cure patients or put them from remissions for long periods of time. But actually, since 2013, the FDA has actually had a mitigation plan where actually manufacturers are supposed to notify the FDA about shortages or potential shortages. But the FDA doesn't really have a whole lot of ability to really accelerate things. They can work with the manufacturers, maybe decrease some of the regulations needed. But if a plant goes down, and there are oftentimes only one or two manufacturing plants for some of these drugs, we're in a significant, difficult
Well,
situation.
let me ask it, and as to your point, this is part of a broader shortage issue, because I know certainly we've had discussions around what's happening with ADHD drugs, which have been in critical short supply. But this is a life or death issue. And is the issue as much about supply chain, or is it also about the economics of these particular drugs?
Well, it's really, I think it's the economics. Most of these drugs are off patent. So they're drugs that are oftentimes made by companies where this is not a particularly important financial aspect of the business. So it's a business decision. It's oftentimes only made maybe by one or two manufacturers because of that. And with sort of an aging population, we're seeing, more cancer diagnoses in certain areas. So there's an increased need for some of these drugs over time, but not a way to get more drugs more quickly to the patients that need them.
So, Dr. Dahut, can you put this in the broader context of what's happening with cancer? Because I know that cancer deaths have dropped significantly, have they not?
They have, yeah. Actually, cancer deaths have fallen, I think, now by 34% since the peak, which was in the early 90s. And I think that's all great news. A lot of that, I think, is probably due to earlier detection, decreased tobacco use, and some of the earlier screening techniques. So new drugs have had a major impact also, but some of these other core drugs have also been very important, I think, on better outcomes.
We're talking about the US market right now. I'm acutely aware of the fact that this market operates in a very different way than other markets where there might be single payer systems, for example. Are there other countries in the world that you think have managed this challenge in a way that we should perhaps look to for, if nothing else, best practices?
It's a great question, and I think that's a something that I know our advocacy group, ACS Can, is currently working on with policymakers. Is there something that can be done better? I think a lot of times, though, these shortages are actually worldwide shortages for some of these drugs. Some of the manufacturing plants are not actually in the United States, so these aren't necessarily things that are part of areas that we control from a manufacturing perspective. But how to sort of come up with a system where there's actually financial support, in a way that makes sense even beyond the life of the patent. And that's what we're talking about here, is the drugs that are off patent, where the financial margin is not great for companies. What can be the incentive for safe production of life impacting agents?
Do you have any estimates? I know it's hard to say, but what the consequences of these shortages? Is it really a life or death situation, or are there other ways in which we'd measure the efficacy of these drugs? Alleviating symptoms, anything like that?
I think it's all of these, because the drugs that are in shortage are sort of broadly across the continuum. The one in prostate cancer, which is actually a new agent, is really for palliation and improvement for patients with advanced disease. Some of the drugs are for folks with much earlier stage disease, to actually shrink up the cancer before you go to surgery, which is the bladder cancer aspect. A drug's called cisplatin or carboplatin. There are drugs for leukemia. And also there's things sometimes that are not actually the drugs itself, but also important sterile products that are in either imaging or in actually infusing drugs. So IV solutions such as dextrose or contrast agents for imaging for CT scans, all part of treating cancer patients, often are on shortages too.
What advice do you have to doctors or patients who are watching this who are experiencing cancer themselves? They're acutely aware of the shortage and very concerned about it.
No, I think it can be pretty terrifying on a local level. So one thing to always think about, is there a clinical trial for your disease in your area? Oftentimes, supply for clinical trial drugs, it may be from a different source, and so that may be helpful. Also, maybe going on to either, we have an 800 number or other aspects, are there other agents or other advice you can get for treatment of your disease? Sometimes there may not be, and sometimes you may be forced to either skip a treatment, skip a dose, or have an alternative therapy, not alternative as far as not FDA approved, but a different therapy than would be ideal, and just have to cross your fingers that you'll have an outcome that is acceptable.
I want to end on the note of a little bit of helping us see around the corner on some of the new drug development, Dr. Dahut. There's been a lot of talk and excitement about essentially cancer becoming a chronic condition at worst. And some of these new drugs, both excitement about the potential, concern about the cost. How do you see it from where you sit?
Well, I think we'd all love cancer to be much more something that where the therapies were much more personalized. And I think that will probably start with screening. So if we had screening for cancer that was much more personalized, much more adaptable, I think we would have a better chance of finding cancer in the patients we need to look at the most carefully earlier on.
Great.
We are excited also about therapeutic prevention trials, looking at folks that are at the highest risk for cancer. Could we come up with a strategy looking at immunotherapy or a vaccine therapy to prevent the cancer from occurring? This could be people that have, a viral infection, such as, if you're HPV positive, you weren't vaccinated as a youth, for example, you have a high risk for like cervical cancer, head and neck cancer. Maybe there's a strategy we can come up to block cancer there. A lot of work on the immune system. It's incredibly exciting. These are often living therapies, and that's the advantage that they can also have the immune system alter, in a way that's more difficult with some of the other targeted treatments. So I think there is a lot of reason to be optimistic, but we need the drugs that are available right now.
Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much.